Good morning, fifth grade class at Lakeview Christian Academy. This is Graham Sparkman with Graham Sparkman Music Production, better known as Casimir's dad. And I'm here today to talk to you about music production, the past, the present, and the future. But before we talk about that, we first have to define what is music production. So music production is the art and the science and the craft of recording and releasing professional music. So this may be one of the hardest videos I've ever shot because I have a tendency to talk a lot and focus on very specific aspects of the music industry. And today I have to talk about, roughly 120-ish years of recorded music in the span of about 30 minutes. Also, I did my homework and I talked to Casimir a little bit and I was like, as a fifth grader, son, what should I stay away from or what should I focus on? What would interest you guys? And here's what he said. This is Casimir.
Dad, you shouldn't just be like a little, like a talking head the whole time because it gets really boring with all the history. And you should make it as interactive as possible and maybe show us more examples and things.
Hey, Casimir, do you feel okay? You don't look very well. Your face looks kind of scrunched up. And what happened to your hair? I've been eating a lot of potato chips. So I took his advice on that. In fact, you'll see a version of myself in your classroom today. That's not actually me. That's my clone. I programmed the clone to be able to answer any questions at the end of this video that you might have about music production. And when the clone is finished, it's going to go out into the parking lot and self-destruct. So be thinking of questions. Hold them to the very end. Buckle your seatbelts because I'm going to take you through about 120 years here extremely quickly. So in the late 1800s, you may have heard of this guy named Thomas Edison. He was an inventor. He invented this thing called the phonograph. It was this big apparatus that you would sing into, and it recorded onto this wax cylinder. It kind of looked like a pop can, and it would cut grooves in it with the sound waves as you sang into that big horn-looking thing. And it sounded horrible. In fact, this is an example of how it sounded. But even though it sounded absolutely horrible, just remember that this was breakthrough technology. Prior to this, if you wanted to hear a playback of your voice, you just had to go to a cave and say, hello, and then wait for the hello, hello, hello. That's the only way you could hear your voice back. So let's skip up to the 1920s. They figured out how to cut the grooves onto a flat disc. It looks like an old-fashioned black record, the ones that you're used to seeing, but it was made out of a different material called shellac, and it wasn't a very good material, and it just didn't sound that great. In the 1920s, music sounded like this. Skip up to like World War II. We're talking the 1940s now. They came up with better materials to record onto. They replaced the old-fashioned shellac with vinyl. So music is getting better and better as we go. Still recording in mono. That means all of the music is just folded right to the middle and coming out of only one speaker. Stereo had not yet been invented. In the 1940s, music sounded like, in fact, here's a recording of Casimir's great-grandfather recording with his band, the Kentucky Hilltoppers, in 1948.
Once you meant a lot to me, but now you're just a used to be. I've taken all I'm gonna take from you. What a fool I was to cry every time you said goodbye. I've taken all I'm gonna take from you.
Now we're in the 1950s, and a lot of interesting things happened during this decade. First of all, stereo was invented, and so now you could have two channels of audio, a left and a right signal, and that means that you could pan the stereo image around to create more spatial audio. It was more three-dimensional than anybody had ever heard prior to that. Big step in technology. Also, with the advent of tape recording, magnetic tape, a man by the name of Les Paul, you may have heard of his guitars, he was doing a lot of experimentation with tape machines in the 50s, and he came up with a way to isolate tracks on tape. So you could have track one, a separate solo track would be track two.
We turn the tape machines on. They're just a standard, regular Ampex tape machine. We play the first part on the guitar. This is the rhythm part. Now you can hear that on here.
That sounds practically the same.
Almost.
All right. Now, what do? Now you put your earphones on and you play another part to it. Is that right?
That's right. All right. I'll play the second part. All right. I'll play a drum part like that.
All right.
And add that on.
Fine.
I'll start with the lead part first. Somewhere there's music, how faint the tune. Somewhere there's heaven, how high the moon. Now I'll add a tenor part to it. Somewhere there's music, how faint the tune. Somewhere there's heaven, how high the moon.
That continued getting more and more sophisticated through the 60s and the 70s, and 2 tracks became 4 tracks. 4 tracks became 8 tracks. Then we had 16 tracks, and by the 1980s, we had like 32 tracks, which was an enormous amount of recording material. So by the time we get into the 70s and 80s, music sounded like this. A lot of people consider the 70s and 80s to be sort of like the prime period for analog music before we went digital. Unfortunately, in the 90s, things kind of went downhill. So let me back up. From the late 1800s all the way to like the 1980s, music was on this steady climb of getting better and better and better quality. And then we hit the 1990s and something called the loudness wars happened and digital music happened. Now, digital music recording was in its infancy and it just didn't sound that good. It sounded harsh. It sounded sterile compared to analog recording. So that was one thing that affected the music adversely. The other thing, as I mentioned, was the loudness wars. People realized that they could make their music as loud as possible, which was not possible in the analog world, but digitally they could. But everything comes with a cost, and this was at the loss of dynamics. So they really squashed the dynamic range. So if you listen to like Alanis Morissette or Oasis or any of those, Green Day, any of those bands in the 90s, it did not sound too good. Also, I need to make mention of the fact that the example that you're going to hear of 90s music here in just a second, it's not like the audio quality is bad. So think back to when we were listening to those really early examples of music in the late 1800s, 1920s. Remember how just bad it sounded? That's the audio quality. This is actually going to sound good. It's just that it doesn't have any dynamics, and that's what makes it sound bad. But if you don't know how to listen for dynamics, then you won't necessarily perceive it as sounding bad. So basically, it just means that it's super loud all of the time. There are no quiet bits in the song. All of the quiet spots have been pushed up to the ceiling to match the loudest spots, which really sounds good for about the first, few minutes when you listen to that kind of music because, sounds good. It's loud. Let's crank it up. Yeah, and get into it. But then humans have this thing called ear fatigue, where if we are blasted with a lot of loud volume over a long period of time, we kind of retract and pull away. No longer sounds loud because we've lost perspective because we can't shift between loud and quiet. So we have learned over the decades that we actually need dynamics in music for it to sound appealing and good over the long haul. In fact, let's hear something.
Backbeat, the word is on the street that the fire in your heart is out. I'm sure you've heard it all before, but you never really had a doubt. I don't believe that anybody feels the way I do about you now.
Now we're up into the early 2000s, and unfortunately, folks, it just doesn't get better. It's still kind of bad at this point because MP3s came out, which is a good thing. It was breakthrough technology, and it came out with this thing called the iPod, and you could put your music MP3 files on it portably and take them wherever you went, which was huge. But the sample rates on those early MP3s were pretty low. And so they just sounded, especially the high frequency information like cymbals, sounded washy and spacey, and it was cutting out a whole chunk of the audible stereo image in order to compress things down to those early MP3s. But as we plow through the 2000s, hard drive space became bigger, technology got better, and MP3s got better. Then streaming platforms came out, and now people can listen to their music everywhere, anywhere, on basically any device, which is huge in terms of convenience. Unfortunately, we're still listening to MP3s, but the MP3s have gotten way better. So when you Bluetooth Spotify, you're hearing an MP3 file from Spotify. So that's where we are presently with music. Nobody's really paying for music anymore because you can hear it for free online, and that has turned the entire music industry upside down. There's just no money to be had in making or creating music. So if you're considering this for a career path, I would say hang on and see what happens in the next 10 years or so. Hopefully things will change for the better. The positive thing is you can hire people for dirt cheap who are absolute professionals, and you can collaborate with anybody all over the world. So in terms of technology for remote collaborations, there's never been more possibilities. Let's quickly talk about the future, and then we're going to move on. So, cyborgs, are they going to take over the music industry? With artificial intelligence being the hot button topic of the day, all I can tell you is that the rules are currently being hashed out. This is sort of the wild, wild west, and it's an ongoing process to determine what's next in terms of how musicians will be credited versus AI musicians and all of the legal jargon that goes along with that kind of boring stuff. But it's important stuff. I would say, and of course, this is just my opinion here, and I'll make this really brief, there are tasteful ways to use technology and there are tacky ways to use technology. And this applies to just about anything. So I've heard of musicians before taking AI and they'll just type in like, I want an 80s song that has a gated reverb snare drum and saxophone and blah, blah, blah. And they send that to the cyborgs. It's, a few minutes later thing. It spits back a song. If you were to just put vocals on that and kind of release it, I just don't think that's very tasteful because it took no creativity to really do that. It took no art and there is no human element. So I would say that would not really, that's not anything that I would personally feel comfortable doing in terms of like doing professional releases. However, I got an email a few weeks ago from a theater company that wanted to take a Broadway musical and they wanted to remove the singing, the vocals from the Broadway recording and just use the instrumentation. And they wanted me to provide this service for them. So I had actually I purchased some AI-based software that does this very thing. It's called stimming. So I stemmed out just the music, removed through AI all of the vocals from the original recording, shot that back to them, and they were super happy. Then they shot me my payment and ended up really liking the music and using it, and it was beneficial for them. So things like this with AI are good ways, are tasteful ways to use it. I took a Keith Mansfield recording the other day and removed the percussion elements from it and used that as an intro to a song. Things like that I can see. That's the future of music, folks, and we'll see where it goes. Thanks so much for sticking with me through all of that information. Let's do a quick studio tour. So I'm just making this for ease with my just handheld. That's why it's a little bit jerky. I have no tripod, but I just wanted to get this video out to you folks. So first of all, let's just talk about my mixing rig. So here at the heart and center is my 1974 Mod 1 console. It is really the driving force behind my whole recording rig. It's what basically gets signal in and out of the computer. From the microphone to the various amplifiers, different instruments, anything that I want to record, even my voice, has to go through this console. Because it's a 1974 console and it's made with actual transformers and coils and preamps, it has a certain sound to it that I really think it adds a certain vibe to my music production. And when people marry vintage analog outboard gear with modern DAW, that stands for Digital Audio Workstation. It's called hybrid workflow. So this is Logic Pro X. It is my digital audio workstation, and I have a session pulled up here. And as you can see, I have all of the tracks. I've got like 45 tracks currently with more to come. So remember when I was saying that, you started out with 2 tracks in the 50s and then the 60s, 4 tracks and then 8 tracks. And then eventually by the 80s, they got up to like 32 tracks. Well, now in the DAW based world, it's unlimited. So software is pretty cool because it emulates pieces of analog outboard gear. For example, here is my 1176 dynamic compressor that I use, which is modeled after one from Universal Audio. Here is a Pultec style EQ, classic vacuum tube driven style EQ from the late 50s, early 60s. It sounds very musical and I use it a ton. This is my Fairchild 670, which lives on the master bus. I love this compressor. So these different pieces of software that I'm showing you are modeled after the analog versions, and you used to have a huge studio to house all of that stuff because it wasn't small. But nowadays, everything can live in your computer, which is amazing, and still give you the same level of quality and sound compared to outboard gear versions. In fact, some people have even failed like a blind test where are you hearing a Fairchild 670 like the virtual version or the old school version? And sometimes people can't even tell the difference. That's how good technology's gotten. Also, you can see here, these are my near field monitors. They are on isolated stands And when I am seated right about here, when I'm mixing music, this one fires at my left ear, this one fires at my right ear, and my head is what they call, is at the axis of the triangle for a balanced, it's like the sweet spot for the listening position. I do have a sub down here, which is a little bit overkill for this size of room, but if I want to wake my neighbors up, I can just crank that thing up. Few instruments on the wall. You guys remember this one? I brought it into to Mrs. Ojard's class. This is the 1956 Rickenbacker tulip shape, and here's an example of how it sounds in my studio.
I'm just a simple man, too shy to preach across this land. Moses struggled with it, I struggle with it too. Romano's got a little tongue-tied, still you promised you'd be right by his side. Moses struggled with it, I struggle with it too.
I have my custom Ramsey banjo that was made just for me by Mike Ramsey of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. My Epiphone EJ200, I usually pull that off the wall when I'm charting music. So Casimir wanted me to show you a synthesizer that's in his room because technically it's been in my studio for a long time. It's actually, I used it a lot on an album that I did back in 2022, but it technically belongs to him. He's videoing right now. So he wanted me to show you the Arturia Microfreak synthesizer, and despite its small size, it's actually pretty huge in terms of what it can do. It's got a bunch of oscillators and envelopes and filters. Everything as a synthesizer goes is adjustable and tweakable. And so it technically belongs to him, but every once in a while, I sneak in here and steal it down to my studio, don't I? And here's a little example of how it sounds in my studio. Here's a little mountain dulcimer I made back when I lived in Kentucky. Now, you guys may have noticed that also I have these wooden panels up over in different areas of my room. There's one there. There's 3 actually on this wall. Then I have one here on the back wall. These are called deflector diffuser absorption panels, and they keep the sound under control. The worst thing that you can have is like if you're cutting a vocal track into a microphone and you're singing, and there's a lot of reverberation. That means that the sound is bouncing off of the walls and coming back into your microphone, and then that gets into the song, which sounds horrible. So this helps keep all of that under control. This is one of my main vocal microphones. This is a Telefunken TF39 vacuum tube driven microphone, and I think it sounds absolutely marvelous. This is my 1972 TIAC 1230 reel-to-reel tape machine. Don't use it for recording everything, obviously, but when I want a certain tape sound, a vibe, I bounce music over to this. Especially percussion sounds really good when you smack the tape really hard. It kind of does that whole analog distortion thing, which can make your drums sound extra crunchy. This up here is a mid-70s Elcom dynamic compressor, yet to be restored. Here's my little action figures there. So hopefully get that one up and running before too long. So now I'm going to share with y'all a little music video that I created as a part of a collaborative project with music producer Warren Hertz and artist Katie Ferreira in Los Angeles, California. So this is how it worked. They recorded their parts originally in Los Angeles and sent me the raw tracks from the recording session. And I added overdubs in my studio here in Duluth, Minnesota. Vocals, mostly some percussion elements. I then mixed and mastered the entire track myself, and they got to hear the end result version. This is just one example of how music collaboration can take place in 2024. Let's jump into the video.
I took my love and I took it down. Climbed a mountain and turned it around, and I saw my reflection in a snow-covered hills. Well, the landslide brought me down. Oh, what is love? Can a child within my heart rise above? Can I sail through the changing ocean tides? Can I handle the seasons of my life? Oh, well, I've been afraid of changing, 'cause I built my life around you. But time makes you bolder, children get older, I'm getting older too. Well, I've been afraid of changing, 'cause I built my life around you. But time makes you bolder, children get older, I'm getting older too. Take my love and take it down. Climb a mountain and turn it around, and I see my reflection in the snow-covered hills, and maybe will the landslide bring it down? Will the landslide bring you down?
So thanks so much for tuning into this episode. I hope you learned something. I hope it wasn't too boring for you guys. Feel free to now ask me any questions. And I was just teasing, that's not a cyborg. I'm actually the cyborg. That's the real Graham Sparkman. So I'm going to self-destruct right